much. I'm happy to be with you all, even if we're locked in our computers this evening. It's fun to get to check in. I see several of my former students on the participant list and friends and colleagues. So I hope you you critique me later. I want to learn with you. As promised, I wanted to talk a little bit about what we're doing now at the Equity Center and in general the work that we're honored to support that is really driven by our partners, but also just take this moment to think through what the notions of design justice look like, especially in these moments of the pandemic and of the uprising. How do we learn from the really important kind of moment of this social movement that we're in addition to this intense global stressor that we're trying to survive. And what does that mean for design? So I don't know for sure, but I'm going to share with you some of the work we're doing right now in hopes that it spurs some good conversation. As Neha said, I'm honored to be the current faculty director for the Center for the Redress of Inequity through Community Engaged Scholarship, which is housed in UVA's Democracy Initiative. They're a wonderful host for us, and so at the end, I'll talk a lot about what that means, what we're doing. We're still relatively new, and in fact, most of our team was hired during the pandemic, so our work has, as you'll see, has been very much there. So that's where I'll end with, but I'll start with design generally. Let's see if I can get this thing to work properly. So when I was starting my PhD in urban planning and thinking about justice and social movements, and especially environmental justice, how people are given the respect and self-determination platforms that they deserve in land use. Hurricane Katrina happened, and I was one of many people asked to come down and help leadership think through how we might solve for these issues. And I was really taken by this gorgeous piece of graphic advocacy that used a slogan that's been used by many social movements, South African disability rights, a lot of different movements that if you've taken my classes, you've seen, because it's been a sort of guiding light for me to think through what this promise might mean if we took it seriously in our profession. So nothing about us without us is for us feels true, and yet is not a way that we make decisions very often, especially when it comes to land. And some of you will not be surprised if we're thinking about this generally, like power and decision-making in land use, that I go back to, this important piece by Sherry Arnstein from 1969. I did a survey a few years ago of community engaged designers that are, self-defining them that way, and asked them about the different methods that they use in their work. And even self-proclaimed community engaged designers still mostly use forms of consultation. So Sherry Arnstein 50 years ago would have said that that's a form of tokenism, and it was a puzzle for me. Okay, well, how do we push up the ladder? Because I don't think we're trying to continue to perpetuate tokenism in our work. So what does it look like to share power? What does it look like to have true partnership and even move towards true citizen control? And so I'll just mention a couple bits about the Resilience for All, which I wrote and as a way to try to work through what's happening nationwide. I won't talk too much about, or I won't talk anything about the projects in it, but I'm happy to share with you if you want more later. But it will help you frame up what I mean when I'm talking about design justice. So as a part of trying to write the introduction to this book, I was trying to figure out the word soup, and asked for practitioners, a couple hundred people, to actually rank on a continuum these different bits of language that we think about in our field, being One continuum being the thing, the goal of the project. Is it product oriented or capacities oriented in terms of like building strength and power in the communities being served, or is it sort of building a beautiful bench, which sometimes builds strength and power, but what's the goal? What's the guiding light? And then also, who's making decisions? Is it more professionally driven or more community driven? And of course, most of the time, both of these things are somewhere along a continuum. So where's the balance? And there was some interesting patterns, some being just about what is free or very low cost, and that was what was accessible. And so creative placemaking, tactical urbanism, pro bono design all fell into that camp. But many communities of color are actually over policed for doing guerrilla urbanist, tactical urbanist work. So it is not free. There are social costs, personal costs to that type of work if we're really trying to think about justice. And then there's a whole bunch in the middle that probably most practitioners think of, that's like sort of the code of ethics for many of our professions, which is just to sort of do responsible work in the public interest. But I was really interested in this quadrant up here that is talking about civil rights goals, equity, power sharing, resource sharing, design justice. You know, what does that really look like when we think about our histories of inequity? And so I also wanted to grapple directly, since I'm a person who cares about urban stressors and the environment and how we kind of deal with these socio-ecological issues in particular, that often have a bigger impact on communities of color. Trying to think through what we can learn from resilience literature, and then also what we might want to bring to resilience literature. And I was really taken by Gunderson and Holling's theories of panarchy, thinking about the city as a complex adaptive system and recognizing that there are times of rapid growth and entrepreneurship, and then there are some winners, and often there's this time of standardization and replication, and it feels like we might, as people that are making the urban world, we've been in a bit of a stagnant phase of increasing standardization, what it looks like to contribute to the design of urban form. But often what happens in many complex adaptive systems is if you stay stagnant in a time of conservation and standardization too long, without adapting and without listening to those people that are feeling the stress, then you end up in a time of creative destruction. And certainly it feels like we're in a destructive moment at the current state of things. And so that does often lead to a time of resource reallocation, redistribution, regeneration potentially. And so I think it's sort of exciting to think about what roles the design professions could play in supporting community-led regeneration. So again, I won't dwell on this too long because this wasn't about Charlottesville and UVA, but what I've tried to learn from these exemplary cases across the country and then bring into my own work are these lessons about building coalitions. Oh, we've got a little feedback, I think, but these lessons about building coalitions, about paying people for their time, not only valuing like we're listening to you, but actually giving power when it's due, recognizing local wisdom, local expertise, lived expertise of a person who has been, surviving despite the oppression of poverty or, the dehumanization of racism, deferring to local wisdom on all things, but especially policing, and really thinking through how small projects can lead towards greater change, but also really looking at the system, right? Interrogating the system. So how does this look for me generally? In Charlottesville, I have been lucky enough to been a part of several projects that involve brilliant young children here in the Charlottesville area. So at Friendship Court, it's a 12-acre site that is in the center of downtown, just south of the downtown mall. And several of you on this call, I've seen your names. You were part of this. In fact, I think I saw Margaret's. There you are, Margaret. But the work has been incredible, partially because we were thinking about sharing power and thinking about sharing resources. And Friendship Court was meant to be a community-driven redesign process. There's 150 families that live there. There had already been an election of a governing board of residents that was majority residents that were making all of the decisions in the process of how to redevelop. There had already been a commitment to zero displacement of any families for any period of time, which is incredibly important and pretty rare in redevelopment projects, and something we need to figure out how to do more often. And then there's a lot of children that didn't have a voice in the process, even though they were a majority stakeholder. And so we started a youth leadership and land use program. We got a grant through the Jesse Ball DuPont Fund here at the university, and really passed it through to our partners who were doing the incredible work, and then just were honored to be able to support it in a myriad of different ways. This is important for lots of reasons. One being that it's our town, and we often extract from our communities. So to properly resource them is a way that we're trying to reorient university contributions, right? If we're the anchor institution, but we also are extractive in nature, that leads to really inequitable patterns, right? So in 2015, this was one of Raj Chetty's interactive maps that he's now moving into an opportunity mapping website. But this, was a really striking thing. It's really, really hard to be a family that doesn't have a lot of income in Charlottesville and to build wealth. And so thinking also about how do we change that? What is that pattern like? If we're in the lowest 3% of communities in the country, that means there's a pattern there, and we need to try to figure out what our role is in not only stopping harming people, but also trying to redress some of those inequities. Some might say that is not surprising, because Charlottesville is built on a pattern of plantations, and I think my colleague Elisa Diamond, who reminds me every day that the history of all of our professions did not start with industrialization, but actually much before with the plantation-scene. And so really, trying to figure out how we look towards repair. But not only in towns where there were, they were built out of the extraction of labor from enslaved communities, but also across the country, because the racial wealth gap is only getting larger. Even after, you'll notice in these graphics, they're the Urban Institute graphics, and you'll see that's 1963. So we were thinking, okay, great, we've got the Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s, and things are going to get better. But as you see in these graphics across the country, they get much worse. And the Racial Equity Institute has consolidated a bunch of different really important research to prove that actually that is a pretty systematic attempt to retain white supremacy in all of these different systems. And I don't think I probably need to tell this audience that there's a lot of ways in which the built world has contributed to these. They're not necessarily even, the slide is not large enough to talk through them. And it's not just red lighting, which is one we know well. I'll talk more about that in a minute. But so these problems exist across the country, but certainly the racial disparities are larger in many senses in university towns. And so starting to think through the role that we as participants in the university might play in redress was important to me. So here's Friendship Court. Since we're in a land use moment, I thought I would geek out with you. We've been able to, this project is already won awards. I'm on the board, so I feel pride, even though I didn't do any of the decision making in the process. I just got to play with some brilliant youth leaders. But just for those of you who care, and you can ask more questions if you'd like later, if you want to get into the details or talk offline. But phase 1 here, the reason we can have 0 displacement is because there's a green space. It's actually a thriving garden that will be a loss that we will have to try to repair and make whole, but it will mean that no one has to leave the site, and that became more important to our community resident leaders than anything else. We've already received many millions of dollars in tax credits for through the state and several awards for the exemplary nature of a resident-driven process. The work has been really beautiful. Grimm & Parker is a firm with several of our alums on it that has a local presence, and they have been wonderful patient contributors to this work. And everyone will be moved in the first 3 phases. Each of them will have mixed income. So these are all place-based Section 8 units right now. And each of our existing community will be a part of a community that has up to 80% of median family income. Many people that live at Frensham Court make a variety of incomes already, but it'll be entirely affordable. And then in phase 4, there's hopefully a wealth building component that allows for the redistribution of wealth to those who have suffered under our oppressive systems for a long time. I'm working with Liz Obu, which you saw in a slide previous on, and Sunshine Mathon, who's trained as an architect, but is also the executive director at Piedmont Housing Alliance, and many of their staff and community partners to try to really think through what repair might look like on every phase of this project, not just phase 4, but it's slow work when it's when it's really done with the full knowledge of all of the experts that including the ones that live there at the table. So we're trying to figure that out in ways that can help the field and not just us. But the youth program, to turn back there, was a wonderful opportunity for us to think through how you ask the questions in a way that is participatory, how people get to analyze their own data even when they haven't been trained as scientists, and then of course how do people get to make decisions. It was a 2-year project where young people were paid for their time. 7 young people really learned everything about land use that one could know, about food justice, about stormwater management. And then we worked with another UVA architecture alum, Alex Gillum, and his team project workshop to actually implement a courtyard design based on the visions of our young leaders that is still there and beautiful right now today, but as the project continues to be redeveloped, will also serve as a prototype for how the courtyards might look different. This is also important work because our fields are too white, and we're losing so much of the creative energy that we could have by maintaining that type of myopic viewpoint in the professions. And so we are lucky that we are able to participate in really trying to revision nationally through our partners at the National Organization of Minority Architects and others, what that pipeline might look like to really transform the field. So the work in Frensham Court has now expanded, driven by Director Elgin Cleckley, who's actually giving a 6 o'clock talk, so you should definitely hear it. You're going to see Elgin come up a lot in the work, and also Gina Ripple, myself, and Elisa Diamond. We were able to work with a local partner, the Public Housing Association of Residents, and youth from a wide variety of communities across Charlottesville to help them design and push towards actual production of a nature playscape in the South First Street community last summer. So we are hoping to figure out ways to actually replicate that even in the COVID experience right now. And that's work that we're doing with the Equity Center. And then in terms of systems change, we've also been looking at how the field of affordable housing is limited by these decision points, and you know, where are we trying to push for good change. And a lot of the change that's happened in you know, in the elevating the standard of practice has been through building assessment systems. So we looked at all of them and to try to understand, okay, who is talking about equity, who's talking about justice, who's talking about culture. And honestly, it was pretty thin in terms of the ways in which local equity and the local, you know, repair is ever considered in our what we value in building assessment systems. So we've been working through a sort of set of thought leaders from across the country, and we're now actually partnered with LISC in piloting what it would look like if you really had a guide to something analogous to a housing market study, but that's actually about honoring not only the expertise and the power, but also the, you know, the resources that should be given to the residents that already live someplace. In affordable housing practice, it's considered successful if about 30 to 40% of residents return. And if you think about the millions of houses that are about to go up, the millions of units of housing that are about to go up for some sort of redevelopment in the low-income housing tax credit world, that's a horrific potential, you know, reiteration of urban renewal. And I don't think any of us want to be a part of the sort of destruction of our lower income and predominantly, you know, minority communities. That it's not the direction we want to go in. We want to go towards justice and repair. So we're trying to think through the mechanisms that might push the field towards that type of practice. And then as an institution, we also want to do better, realizing that there were all of these ways in which university towns were often, you know, creating or replicating these moments where we were not paying a living wage, for instance. I was a part of a president's council during this time that actually raised the base wage here at UVA starting this last January to $15 an hour. But many universities across the country participate in, you know, contract labor and other things that that continue to, you know, lower the ability to build wealth if you are a person that lives and works at the university, especially if you have an hourly job that doesn't happen in the summer. So thinking through how we begin to transform from a position of extraction and to one of partnership and respect and benefit, and then even hopefully towards redress, is where the Equity Center wanted to go. So we were founded with some bold mission and vision, and everything we've done has been co-created with brilliant leaders from the community that are really keeping us moving in the right direction. And that's been really a deep joy to be a part of. We have a set of founding initiatives that continue to grow. I'll show you some of the work in the democratization of data and the work under Elgin's direction that I mentioned earlier with youth educational pipelines is now a part of a sort of patchwork of programs that we support. And I'll talk a little bit more about the Community Research Review Board as well. But for us, youth power is important. It's a group of faculty from across the university, so it's not just architect, planner, designer types. There's people from the School of Education, people from nursing and medicine and music and public policy and psychology. There's a whole range of brilliant people at the table, but more importantly, there's a governing body that holds us accountable, and we get their direction from them. We get partnership from them, and we always value their time. And we try to always maintain a sense of, that was exciting, a sense of rigor to self-evaluation, making sure that we are always being the best partners on the university side that we can be. I will say this is not new. There have been lots of professions that do, or disciplines that do this well. So community-based participatory research, here's a piece from 2010, and in the public health world, it's actually participatory action research, activist science. There's a lot of terms used in the different disciplines, and what the Equity Center aspires to do is actually bring all of those marginalized subfields within these different disciplines together so that they have the support to do this work well and to be legible and supportive and you know, good partners to the community leaders that would like to, you know, participate in the scholarship that's happening, but need it to be useful to them as well. One of the things we're really proud of is a community research review board that we support, but we do not lead. So the Public Housing Association of Residents had taken note of, you know, and counted at one point how many different research projects were happening at UVA that were affecting their community. And I think when I arrived about 6 years ago, there were 28 different projects happening at one time where, you know, people were knocking on their doors from UVA, all discrete, and that becomes a violence if you're anyone. You don't want 28 different distinct research projects asking to extract knowledge from you. And they knew there were really good models of Indigenous research sovereignty, and so they did some work with David Edmonds and a few other professors at UVA, and came up with, this is actually a version from genomic research, but I just wanted to give you all something that you could read up on. But really with, you know, bringing in not only the ethics of IRB, an internal review board that you would normally go through to do community, you know, engaged research, but also equity and reciprocity, and in all stages of the process, including you know, scoping the research, but also through to dissemination. We are also trying to help create decision support tools. So one of our cherished partners is the Albemarle County Office of Equity and Inclusion. It's a new office in the county. They're trying to develop equity profiles to really understand what goals of equity look like in the county in terms of well-being and everyone having, you know, enhanced well-being, and then also you know, ask us to help them not only with their equity profile and with participatory. You can see here actually Andrew Monshine and Eric Fields designed a participatory mapping tool that helps people in a kind of a fun, engaging way answer a series of questions that the Office of Equity Inclusion were curious about in terms of their work. And then we've been working with Dr. Michelle Claiborne, who's our lead data scientist at the Equity Center and also in the libraries and teaches in the Batten School, developing an interactive tool that allows you to really think through different equity issues. And this was something that city council members, as well as you know, community activists were calling for. Just there's not policy analysts on staff, and so how do we know when things have changed, when things have improved? So we've been working towards the co-production of a series of interactive tools that allow you to really deeply engage and ask those questions, not only in government, but also outside of it and alongside of it. And then I'm asked this a lot, so I thought I would address it here. In this moment of a pandemic where we are all feeling scared and limited and sick, or, you know, out of work, what is the role that our field can play? And so I don't have a great answer. Theorists of the past and try to think about self-organized systems as one of the answers. And there's been amazing work happening in Charlottesville that we have just been honored to be a part of. The Equity Center was positioned very well as a new organization that's really driven by our partners to be able to support in some ways. Our pandemic-informed projects, for lack of a better phrasing, have sometimes been about advocacy. We are lucky that the UVA President's Office actually asks us for our help when they have a question they're not sure about the answer of, and they were really not sure how to best support community, and we worked with a bunch of the wise people in this town to help them understand that actually paying contract workers was the first step in that process. So that was an early success when we were trying to make sure that an equity-oriented lens was taken to the pandemic work, and we were proud to be a part of that effort. We have been really trying to educate on the social determinants of health and how there are disparate experiences of COVID. So saying we're all in this together is sometimes not entirely accurate, because there are, the social determinants of health that are like things like suffering racism, but there's also, the disparate experiences because you're a frontline worker and you're, at a greater risk of exposure because of the work you do, and should be compensated and protected because of that. So it's moved on to other types of advocacy, but on our website, you'll find we have interactive displays about like who are our frontline workers and what might be the ways in which we can support them in an ongoing way through the fall. And we're working with the city, the county, and the university to think through. It was still called a Frontline Workers Bill of Rights at the drafting of this, but we're now calling it a Fair Treatment Charter, and hoping for adoption of that as we move towards reopening the university. We were asked by one of our cherished colleagues, Jordy Yeager, who did a really beautiful series called Determined with Sarad Davenport and a few other also long-term Charlottesville natives. And this one we did on stop and frisk at his request, and really through through the analysis of data he had obtained, but we were honored to do it. And then also we have supported community-driven testing. So where the Dr. Cameron Webb is on our leadership team, and he helped ask community leaders along with our executive director Ben Allen, what do you need? How can I support you? And they said, we are the trusted anchors in our community. We just need good testing. So the doctors actually came and are still coming on a regular basis to sites across Charlottesville where there are trusted anchor institutions that are community-based, so that we can ensure that the communities of color that are often at greater risk because of structural racism can get access to the testing that they need. And then we have another interactive experience that sort of supports all of this and has helped the county in particular try to figure out, county's a very large space, try to figure out where there might be pockets where people need support but are not yet getting that support, just based on indicators that might have you at a higher burden of sheltering in place. So really helping to bridge that gap when there are burdens being experienced, and we're all at greater risk when we don't take a justice mindset to recovery. Interrogating our systems. This can happen in a la the work of Deanna Van Buren, another UVA grad of the A School who does incredible work on restorative justice practices, or actually our own Equity Center, brilliant lead who's a student here at UVA, but incredibly talented Sam Powers, who before we recruited him was doing work with the ACLU on incarceration and interrogating that from a systems perspective in terms of data visualization, which I think is very much a thing that the design fields should feel like we can be a part of. We should figure out how we can be humble contributors to interrogating these systems and hopefully working towards repair. We are slowly moving at the Equity Center to a set of interactive data visualizations that address disparities along race and income and other things, but also really show the root causes of these inequities, and also how we might have a pro-equity stance. This is actually something that King County, Washington developed for their strategic plan in 2015, but I think it does a really good job of visually conveying these complex systems and what it might look like to take a pro-equity stance in our policies and practices, many things of which relate to the built environment. And then I'll say, you know, building power through relationships has been so critical to our work. We have been so lucky. The Charlottesville Food Justice Network, which is now a part of Cultivate Charlottesville, is a group that's built an incredible resident-driven infrastructure for activism that they want to see towards, you know, a conception of health that thinks about food, that thinks about wellness, that thinks about you know, removing racism, you know, really getting us to a, you know, to a version of well-being that's for everyone, and those relationships, that those, you know, connectors of that network are so important. So we are aspiring to, you know, to be worthy of the partnership of the amazing people, both at that's Chantel Bingham, one of our leaders in the local steering committee and a cherished partner who is one of the directors of the Cultivate Charlottesville Food Justice Network, and that is Joy Johnson, who is the president of the Public Housing Association of Residents, in a local piece that actually talked about the incredible work they're doing along food justice in Charlottesville now. So we are often supporting them, and in partnership with them, like right now, when you do the community-driven testing events, if you test positive, we are a part of the team that helps you get the wraparound services you need, often coordinated by Chantel and others, but to make sure that you can shelter in place while you heal, which is not only important for your own family, but also for our entire community. We have been honored to be a part of full storytelling. This is actually something from Minneapolis. They recently have a new strategic plan that is actually their comprehensive plan, and it's eliminating disparities is the very first goal in their comprehensive plan, which I think in many ways was you know, something they could have a community conversation about, because they mapped all of the racial covenants in Minneapolis that have perpetuated inequities, and then, you know, that's a part of planning and design to try to redress those. And our own colleague Jordy Yeager, who I already mentioned in terms of the Determined series, is also leading something that you can do from the comfort of your own home, is be a part of this kind of barn-raising collective effort to map all of the racial covenants and the disparate original provisions of infrastructure along those lines. And it's a project our students at the A School have actually been able to help with for the last few years as well. And then in terms of the Racial Equity Task Force, we're still knee deep in that work. So it's not quite ready for broad sharing and pronouncements, but it should be in the next few weeks. What we have done that I think is an important, you know, practice to hold up is not just looking at the, you know, and listening to the voices of today, but also honoring the activism that's happened over time. This is another, we've asked Elgin Cleckley, my brilliant colleague from the A School, to help us design an interactive tool that's almost ready for you all, to think through the different streams of activism and the different calls for action over the last 50 years and at UVA. And then also a library that allows you to engage with those themes along over time and thematically as well. And then in my own personal work, you know, the goal for me is to try to do my part to think towards systems change that gets our fields participating to something like, you know, the just transition, where we stop thinking about extractive economies and start thinking about how we participate in living systems. So I've talked for long enough. I want to make sure we have time for whatever version of discussion this allows. So I'll stop.